Moscow, 1979. It was a sunny winter day. Guests were gathering outside one of the capital's marriage palaces. Champagne was chilling, cameras were loaded, and the air was filled with laughter and cheerful complaints about the cold. Suddenly, the bride burst out of the doors, hiked up her dress, and ran away. Her maid of honor tried to follow, but her shoes slipped on the snow, slowing her down. The bride turned a corner. The maid of honor only managed to see her getting into a black Volga car, which immediately sped away and disappeared into the narrow side streets. A stunned crowd of guests and a pale groom were left standing outside the ZAGS. On the snow lay a lost bouquet. This story began like a movie scene, but its ending was far from happy. Later that same day, a fisherman found the bride's body on the snowy bank of a river near Moscow. Within an hour, the investigative team was on the scene. The victim was identified as Olga Tishchenko, the runaway bride. The cause of death was a needle mark on her neck. Experts could not provide more specific information, pending further analysis. It took the police very little time to confirm that Olga had fled her own wedding shortly before her death. The entire story was bizarre and unusual. The guests of the failed wedding were gathered and questioned. The maid of honor and bridesmaids unanimously claimed that Olga loved the groom and was eagerly anticipating the marriage. On the wedding day, she was radiant with happiness, until a strange man approached her, handed her a bouquet and a small casket, and quickly walked away. Opening the casket and seeing an old brooch inside, Olga turned pale, froze for a few seconds, and then abruptly bolted for the doors of the ZAGS. The groom, Arkady Koshalev, also swore he loved Olga and couldn't imagine what would have made her run. Many questions remained unanswered. The murder weapon could not be determined. The experts were puzzled. What kind of needle was it? Olga's relatives suggested it might be a pin from a brooch, a family heirloom kept by Olga's mother, who was elderly, ailing, and living in the Kaluga region, and thus not present at the wedding. This was the same brooch the stranger had given Olga with the bouquet at the ZAGS. Olga ran off holding the brooch. Who was this stranger? How did he get the brooch? And wasn't this man the key to this strange case? The investigators decided to visit Klavdia Ivanovna Tishchenko, Olga's mother. Arriving at the village, the detectives approached her house. Silence. They knocked. Silence again. They walked around the house and noticed a second, slightly ajar entrance. This struck the officers as odd. It was winter. They pushed the door open and entered. Everything was in its place, but the house was empty and cold, meaning the stove hadn't been lit recently. Suddenly, one of the officers heard a faint sound coming from beneath the floor. The cellar. They pulled back the rug and found a trapdoor. Opening it, they saw Klavdia Ivanovna below, frightened and shivering from the cold. Someone had locked her in the cellar. The officers pulled the woman out, wrapped her in 2 sheepskin coats, and lit the stove. Warmed up, the woman was able to speak. She told the police that 2 days ago, her future Svatya, the groom's mother, had visited, explaining her wish to get acquainted since they would soon be relatives. But when Klavdia Ivanovna went down to the cellar for pickles and other treats, the trapdoor slammed shut above her. She was certain she would not have survived if the police hadn't found her. The investigators exchanged puzzled looks. They hadn't interviewed the guests and knew that Arkady Koshalev's mother had died when he was a child. They asked about the brooch. Klavdia Ivanovna retrieved a small casket where she kept her valuables, opened it, and gasped, the brooch was gone. Only the brooch, everything else was still there. Who was the woman who claimed to be Arkady's mother? And why would she try to take a life for a mere brooch? The case was getting increasingly complicated, full of illogical and baffling actions by unknown people. The police decided to take a closer look at Arkady Koshelev. What was Olga Tishchenko's groom like? A Moscow native, a hairdresser, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But with persistence and inquiries, the detectives uncovered that the young man was living far beyond a modest hairdresser's salary. He was a gigolo, living off wealthy, older women. A new theory immediately emerged: perhaps one of these women didn't want Arkady to marry the young and beautiful Olga. Arkady was placed under surveillance. Soon, the detectives obtained the address of an apartment he visited regularly. It belonged to Nonna Kosaya, the 48-year-old manager of a major Moscow food warehouse. Eager to solve the case, the detectives skipped the usual caution and summoned Nonna Kosaya for questioning. The woman became flustered when she realized the police knew about her relationship with Arkady. She then began to tell her story. Her husband had left her for a younger woman, so after the divorce, Nonna kept her distance from men, seeing them all as traitors. She met Arkady at the hair salon. He gave her a luxurious haircut that made her look significantly younger. Her friends were envious and begged her to introduce them to Arkady. So, Arkasha became a regular guest at Nonna's home, where he styled her well-off friends. In return, he received money and valuable gifts. Slowly, he grew closer to Nonna herself. He managed to melt her heart. The middle-aged woman blossomed and almost immediately began financially supporting her beau, since hairdressers don't earn much. Over time, Arkasha grew accustomed to this, became capricious, and constantly demanded money and expensive gifts. Nonna always obliged. Then, Arkady met the young Olga Tishchenko and truly fell in love. He told Nonna he wanted children and a family, and therefore planned to marry Olga. However, he promised not to abandon her if Nonna continued to be generous. Arkady's betrayal crushed Nonna, but she couldn't bring herself to leave him. And despite intense jealousy, she claimed she had not touched his bride. Nonna Kosaya seemed to be telling the truth, but experienced detectives trusted facts, not words. The woman was released but remained a suspect. The very next day, an urgent call came from Nonna Kosaya's address. The police officers who arrived found the front door ajar. Inside the apartment, they found a wounded Nonna Kosaya in the kitchen. Next to her lay an unknown man with a knife in his hand. Apparently, he had attacked the apartment's owner, who defended herself by hitting him with a cast-iron skillet. Nonna explained that the man was her unofficial driver, Denis Volkov, whom she hadn't mentioned publicly. That evening, he came to her, demanding to know what the police wanted. Nonna playfully dismissed him, saying they were looking for a criminal, not him. But upon seeing Volkov's tense expression, she suddenly realized he was the killer. He grabbed a knife from the table and lunged at her, but Nonna managed to snatch the skillet and swing it. The detectives reasonably asked what motive Volkov had for killing Olga Tishchenko. Nonna claimed he was secretly in love with Olga and was deeply upset when he found out she was getting married. Nonna Kosaya and the miraculously surviving Denis Volkov were sent to the hospital, while the detectives searched the apartment. The place was luxuriously furnished and impeccably tidy. Only the slightly open front door seemed suspicious. The detectives were also troubled by Nonna's story. It all seemed strange and illogical. During a search of Volkov's clothing, they found a brooch, the same one that belonged to Olga Tishchenko's family. While it seemed like the key piece of evidence, the detectives were puzzled. Why would a killer carry the murder weapon with him? The seasoned investigators could only come up with one logical answer: it was all a setup. Nonna Kosaya had invited Volkov home, deliberately left the door ajar, knowing she would call the police herself, and staged the attack to frame him. But how could they force her to confess? Volkov was still unconscious, but they could trick her. The police visited Nonna Kosaya in the hospital, and informed her that Volkov was alive, had regained consciousness, and was ready to give a statement. Kosaya shrugged indifferently and turned to face the wall. The officers left the room but stayed to watch the hospital exit. 5 minutes later, a fully dressed Nonna Kosaya attempted to flee and was detained at the doors. She knew the detectives lacked serious proof of her guilt, and denied everything during the interrogation, until she was informed that Klavdia Ivanovna Tishchenko was alive and ready to identify the woman who had visited her, posing as Arkady's mother, and locked her in the cellar. There was no point in denying it further, and Nonna Kosaya began to confess. However, she kept mixing up her stories and eventually retracted her statements. The full truth was only revealed when Denis Volkov actually recovered and began answering the police's questions. By combining Kosaya's confused statements and Volkov's testimony, the detectives were finally able to reconstruct the events. Nonna Kosaya did not want to lose Arkady. She knew a young wife and a child would inevitably draw him away, and money couldn't buy his affection. Nonna immediately decided to act ruthlessly. A couple of days before the wedding, Volkov drove Kosaya to Klavdia Ivanovna Tishchenko's home. The driver stayed out of his employer's affairs and had no idea that Nonna had locked the poor old woman in the cellar. Nonna had no other choice, otherwise, the old woman would have recognized her. After stealing the brooch, Nonna first decided to scare Olga. She wrote her a letter threatening that if she married Arkady, she should say goodbye to her mother. Olga didn't take the letter seriously. But when Denis Volkov brought her the bouquet and the brooch at the wedding, Olga remembered the threat, panicked, and ran out of the ZAGS. She chased Volkov, demanding answers. Volkov merely put her in the car and silently drove her outside the city. He thought it was a surprise for the bride, as Nonna herself had told him. When he brought Olga Tishchenko to the location, she immediately bolted from the car toward Nonna, who was standing a short distance away. Nonna Kosaya was waiting for her with a rope. But she hadn't expected Olga to rush at her, shaking her shoulders and frantically demanding to know what happened to her mother. Nonna lost her footing and fell into the snow with Olga. At that moment, the brooch fell out of the bride's dress. A panicked Nonna grabbed it, swung her arm, and Olga went limp. Nonna stood up, brushed herself off, took the brooch, and walked back to the car. Volkov hadn't seen the whole scene, but he began to suspect something was wrong when Nonna returned alone and demanded to drive back to Moscow. The honest driver was troubled and called Nonna with his questions. Nonna realized Volkov was a dangerous witness, and decided to eliminate him. She invited him to her home and staged the attack, planting the brooch to frame him for Olga's death. However, Volkov's head was tougher than she thought. He survived, and all of Nonna's plans failed. The court sentenced Nonna Kosaya to 15 years in prison. Denis Volkov was not prosecuted, as no crime was found, nor was there one. Arkady Koshalev also escaped consequences, though his indirect guilt was great. for without him, this tragedy would never have occurred. But in the eyes of the law, he was innocent.